So we're here in San Jose, California, just after the end of Apple's WWDC 2018 Developers Keynote, and you know what? This was the most Google keynote that Apple has ever presented. What do I mean by that? Apple announced a ton of stuff that is almost exactly like what Google announced at Google I/O last month, like feature for feature the same thing. What I want to do is I want to look at all of the features that both Apple and Google announced in the past couple of months and compare them and see how Google does it Google's way and Apple does it Apple's way. But you know, one thing was the same. Usually Apple gives you a clear overarching theme at its keynotes. You sort of get a narrative thread, but this time they just announce a bunch of stuff, which is exactly what Google does at its keynotes. Even though this was the most googly Apple keynote in quite a while, trust me, Apple is still Apple. All right, so we're back in the studio, and honestly, there's a lot of stuff we could go through, and I want to just jump through really rapid fire on a few of them just to get started. And well, here, just do this so you can look at some stuff here. Okay, so the first thing is this time well spent stuff. Apple calls it screen time, Google calls it digital well-being, but it's basically an app that lets you see how much time you're using on all of the apps on your phone, and it's very, very similar. Another thing that's very, very similar, oh my God, I think they might have fixed notifications in iOS. I'm so excited. We made a video about this before, but you can now group notifications and you can turn off notifications directly from the notification without digging into settings. And now the last thing I want to do just really quick is Apple Photos, and yo, it is a straight rip of Google Photos. They have these exact same features. They've got this For You section where it's like the Google Assistant section where it magically creates fun little things with your pictures. They have advanced search that lets you look inside the photos and string chains of different searches together. And they have suggested sharing where it looks at who's in the photos and suggests that you make a shared album with those people, just like Google Photos does. But the difference is Apple Photos, when you make those shared albums, they're end-to-end encrypted. They don't depend on Apple looking at it in the cloud, where Google Photos, Google puts their stuff in the cloud. Now, Apple's end-to-end encryption is the big story here. It's the main thing that they do differently than the way Google does it. And that difference becomes really important throughout this entire story. Another really good example of it is shared augmented reality. Both companies announced that you could have a shared augmented reality experience among multiple devices. Google's is cross-platform, Apple's isn't. And you know what? Rather than me talk about it, this is the one thing we got to try at WWDC, so let's take a look at it. We've joined the game that's being hosted over there, and so now you can see the whole table. What's interesting about this is us having this shared AR experience is happening all locally. This is all just getting done directly over Wi-Fi. So all the data about the position of all these things, I see it, he sees it, it's all happening without having to go up to the cloud, which is different than the way Google does it. They use this thing called cloud anchors, which syncs it up to the cloud and then back down again. Apple's also really good at recognizing that, this object and that object, these two iPads, they both know that this table is here and that this is a shared world. And so when I send something over to this guy, he's learning how to do it. I'm just gonna dunk on him right now by going at him. Okay, so I really hope that Vera and Felicia chose to show you the cut where I won that game, because I lost most of those games. True story, when you lose a game, the word victory is spelled backwards because, it's a shared augmented reality and it actually has the right perspectives. Anyway, what I really want to talk to you guys about are two features that I think are the most important things that Apple announced at WWDC. The first is this new shortcuts feature, and it's very similar to what's on Android P, which is called Actions and Slices. So an app's function breaks out of the app into the rest of the operating system, either in search or the widget panel or whatever. Now, the way Apple does it is you actually set it up yourself. It's more configuration. The way Android P does it is you just have to trust Google is going to just know everything and figure it out for you. They're very similar, but the Apple way, it's more configured, it's more local. The Google way, you just have to trust Google. But the most important thing, the biggest news out of WWDC by far, in my opinion, is this new paradigm for the way apps are going to work on macOS in the future. This was actually my favorite moment of the keynote when Craig Federighi was up there and he asked, are we finally going to merge macOS and iOS? And his answer was no. 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 It's going to be something much more complicated and frankly much more interesting. But before we get into that, I want to talk about how Google does this, because they've already done this move. They have taken Android apps and put them on Chrome OS. But Google did it in a super googly way. They released a pretty janky beta that literally just took a phone app and slapped it on the desktop. And Chromebooks have touchscreens so you could scroll or whatever, but it worked with mouse clicking. And they just put that out in the world and let people mess around with it. And then over time, as they evolve the operating system, they're slowly evolving Android apps. So eventually you're going to be able to do window resizing and have proper windowing and all the rest of the stuff. But that Google way of just like, screw it, put it out there and see how people react to it and we'll fix it, once it's out there, is not the way Apple wants to work. Here's how Apple is doing it. So iOS and macOS both have the same like Unix underpinnings, right? But they have different ways to build the user interfaces. And so what Apple is doing is it's taking the user interface builder for iOS and it's adding it into macOS. It's called UIKit. And so you can take a bunch of stuff that you've done to build your iOS app, do some tweaking in apps developer platform, it's called Xcode, and then it'll turn into a Mac app that feels like a Mac app where you can resize the windows and it has proper scrolling and it doesn't work with touchscreens because Macs don't have touchscreens. I'm a little bit nervous. I played around with the Home app, which basically felt like an iPad app just put on the Mac screen. You could resize the windows and that was great, but I really wanted to touch the buttons because it was a button interface that was designed for a touchscreen. But here's the bottom line. Having mobile apps on a desktop operating system is surprisingly great. Even in those early janky Chrome OS betas with Android apps, it was surprisingly useful to just have a little Instagram app or a little to-do app instead of a full-blown desktop app or a web app in a container Electron thing. There's just literally millions and millions and millions of them for iOS, and I would love to see some of those hit macOS. Okay, so what did we learn? Well, we learned a bunch of stuff about Google. They do Google things in very googly ways. They release stuff before it's ready for developers to screw around with it and fix it, and they figure it out over time. They ask you to trust the Google Assistant a lot. Everything goes up to the cloud. Google analyzes it with their machine learning algorithms or whatever. You don't have to do as much configuration, which I like. It's actually a little bit simpler than Apple's way, but in order for all that stuff to work, you have to give the Google Assistant a ton of access to your data and information. Now, the Apple way, very different. You have to do a little bit more configuration, especially with the shortcut stuff. And while I love that that gives me as the user more control, I'm not sure I need that much control, or I'm not sure I want to take the time to set all that stuff up. Of course, the other Apple thing to do is keep everything end-to-end encrypted so that nobody can see your stuff except you and the people you might happen to share it with. This is why I'm really excited to see what happens when iOS 12 and Mojave come out this fall, because we'll be able to compare those two approaches, except no, we can't, because the most important difference between these two companies is that when iOS says that they're going to ship a new version of an operating system, it goes out to millions and millions of customers and they all get to upgrade right away. Whereas with Android P, not so much. A tiny sliver of people get the latest version of Android and everybody else has to wait a really long time. So the big difference between these two approaches is, honestly, Apple ships. The worm is turned in this apple. Even though this is a really Google keynote, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. We're going to be making these videos a lot more because an apple a day keeps the Google away.